The phone slipped from Detective Rodriguez's trembling fingers, clattering against the hospital's linoleum floor as he stared at the blood-soaked bridge surveillance footage. What he'd assumed was another suicide attempt had just become something far more sinister. On the screen, Ethan Blackwood wasn't trying to talk the young woman down. He was pulling her back from the edge while cradling his unconscious 4-year-old daughter against his chest. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., the exact moment Grace Blackwood's heart had stopped beating. Eleanor Walsh gasped from the doorway, her weathered hands flying to her mouth as she recognized the heiress everyone thought had disappeared. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "That's Victoria Montgomery." The same Victoria Montgomery whose pharmaceutical empire had been systematically poisoning children like Grace for profit. The same company that had murdered Ethan's wife 3 years ago. "Get me Charles Montgomery on the line," Rodriguez barked into his radio, ice forming in his veins. "Now!" How long had she been watching them? And was saving Ethan's daughter part of some twisted game? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Ethan Blackwood had been Seattle's most decorated firefighter, the kind of man who ran into burning buildings while others ran out. Now he stood in the unemployment line, holding his daughter's tiny hand as they waited for food stamps. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd saved hundreds of lives but couldn't save his own family from poverty. Grace tugged on his worn jacket, her pale face looking up at him with those impossibly blue eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah. "Daddy, why does my chest hurt when I run?" she asked, the question that had been haunting him for weeks. At 4 years old, she shouldn't know what shortness of breath felt like, shouldn't have to rest after climbing a single flight of stairs. The diagnosis had come like a sledgehammer. Congenital heart defect requiring immediate surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. Doctor. Sarah Chen had explained it gently, but the numbers were brutal. $500,000 for the experimental procedure that could save Grace's life. Ethan made $18 an hour in construction when he could find work. Their cramped apartment in Pioneer Square reeked of mold and broken dreams. Eleanor Walsh, their 78-year-old neighbor, watched Grace when Ethan worked double shifts. The retired nurse had become their guardian angel, sharing her meager Social Security checks and homemade soup when the cupboards ran bare. "That child needs medicine, not just love," Eleanor had said one evening, watching Grace struggle to breathe after a simple game of patty cake. Her weathered hands shook as she counted pills from her own prescription bottles, rationing heart medication between herself and the little girl she'd grown to love like her own granddaughter. Meanwhile, across the city in a glass tower that scraped the Seattle sky, Victoria Montgomery pressed her forehead against the floor-to-ceiling windows of her father's penthouse. The Space Needle looked like a toy from the 52nd floor, and she felt just as small and insignificant despite the billions her name commanded. Her reflection stared back, hollow cheeks, designer clothes that hung like expensive shrouds, and eyes that had seen too much for 24 years. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light. A 10-carat prison sentence to a man she'd never loved, chosen by a father who saw her as nothing more than a business asset. The Montgomery Pharmaceuticals empire had been built on her mother's grave, quite literally. Margaret Montgomery had died refusing experimental cancer treatments, choosing dignity over desperation. Charles had taken that tragedy and twisted it into profit, creating the very medications that might have saved her, then pricing them beyond reach of families like the ones Margaret had grown up with. Victoria's laptop glowed with spreadsheets that made her stomach turn. Project Heartstring, pediatric trials on low-income children, testing heart medications with a 40% survival rate. The faces in the files looked like angels, innocent, trusting, unaware they were guinea pigs in her father's grotesque experiments. She'd tried to leave twice, tried to expose him once. Each time, Charles had found her, brought her back, reminded her that walking away meant losing everything, and that everything included the power to eventually make things right. The September storm hit Seattle like a living thing, clawing at windows and howling through the streets with the fury of a wounded animal. Ethan gripped the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against sheets of rain that turned the world into a watercolor nightmare. Grace lay unconscious in the passenger seat, her lips tinged blue, her breathing so shallow it barely fogged the window beside her small face. "Hold on, baby girl," he whispered, pressing harder on the accelerator as they approached Aurora Bridge. The speedometer climbed past 60, but it still didn't feel fast enough. Grace's heart episode had started during bedtime stories, her favorite book about brave princesses falling from her tiny hands as she clutched her chest and gasped for air that wouldn't come. The truck's engine coughed, sputtered, then died with a mechanical groan that echoed Ethan's breaking heart. Steam poured from under the hood as they rolled to a stop in the bridge's emergency lane. The hospital was still 2 miles away. The ambulance he couldn't afford to call would take 20 minutes in this storm, and Grace's breathing was getting weaker by the second. Ethan gathered his daughter in his arms, her small body limp as a rag doll, and stepped into the savage wind. Rain immediately soaked through his jacket, but Grace remained dry beneath the only waterproof coat he owned, Sarah's old raincoat that still smelled faintly of vanilla and hope. Each step forward was a battle against nature itself, lightning illuminating the bridge in stark, terrifying snapshots. That's when he saw her. Victoria Montgomery stood on the bridge's outer railing, her bare feet gripping the narrow ledge with the desperation of someone who had already let go inside. The designer dress that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent clung to her frame like liquid shadow, and her dark hair whipped around a face so beautiful and broken it took his breath away. She stood perfectly still in the chaos, arms slightly outstretched, looking like a Gothic angel preparing for flight. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, time stopped. Ethan looked down at Grace, felt her weak pulse against his chest, calculated the distance to the hospital, weighed his daughter's life against a stranger's death. The moral arithmetic was impossible. Save the woman and risk losing precious minutes, or let her fall and live with that choice forever. "Hey!" he shouted over the wind, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Don't jump!" Victoria turned toward his voice, her green eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected an audience for her final act. Certainly not a man carrying a child through a storm like some modern-day Atlas bearing the weight of the world. The movement shifted her balance and her left foot slipped on the rain-slick metal. She fell forward. Ethan lunged, his free arm shooting out to catch her wrist just as she pitched toward the churning black water 40 feet below. The impact nearly sent them both over the edge, Grace's weight throwing off his center of gravity as Victoria's full body weight yanked his shoulder from its socket. Pain exploded through his arm like liquid fire, but his grip held. "I've got you," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. Victoria dangled in the wind like a broken marionette, her designer dress transformed into a shroud that flapped around her legs. Below them, the Puget Sound waited with the patience of a grave. "Let me go!" she screamed up at him, rain and tears mixing on her face. "You don't understand. I'm not worth saving." "Everyone's worth saving," Ethan grunted, his muscles screaming as he fought to pull her up while keeping Grace secure against his chest. His daughter stirred slightly, her breathing even more labored now, and panic clawed at his throat like a living thing. With strength he didn't know he possessed, Ethan hauled Victoria over the railing and onto the relative safety of the walkway. She collapsed against him, sobbing and shaking, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. For a moment they were just three broken souls huddled together against the storm, the desperate father, the suicidal heiress, and the dying child who connected them in ways none of them could yet understand. "The hospital," Ethan said urgently, looking down at Grace, whose lips were now decidedly blue. "My daughter. She's dying." Victoria looked at the small face pressed against Ethan's chest, and something fundamental shifted in her expression. The hopelessness cracked, replaced by a fierce determination that surprised them both. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and dialed. "I need a medical helicopter at Aurora Bridge, emergency pediatric cardiac event," she said with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes, I'll take full financial responsibility. Victoria Montgomery, just get here now." As the helicopter's searchlight cut through the storm like a sword of hope, Ethan stared at the woman he'd just saved, finally understanding that sometimes the person you rescue ends up rescuing you right back. The helicopter's rotors cut through the storm like mechanical thunder, casting searchlight beams that turned the rain into falling diamonds. Within minutes, Grace was strapped to a gurney, oxygen mask covering half her tiny face, while paramedics worked with the efficiency of people who fought death for a living. Ethan gripped her small hand through the chaos, whispering prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. Victoria sat across from them in the helicopter's cramped cabin, her soaked designer dress plastered against her shivering frame. She watched the paramedics work on Grace with an intensity that seemed almost maternal, her green eyes following every movement of their trained hands. When one of the medics called out Grace's blood pressure dangerously low, Victoria's face went white as bone. "Seattle Children's Hospital, Trauma Bay 3, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Below them, the city spread out like a circuit board of light and shadow, every illuminated window representing someone else's struggle, someone else's hope, hanging by a thread. The emergency room exploded into controlled chaos the moment they arrived. Dr. Sarah Chen, Grace's cardiologist, was already waiting with a team of nurses and specialists. Grace was whisked away on a river of urgent voices and the squeak of wheels on linoleum, leaving Ethan standing in the sudden silence, feeling like he'd been hollowed out with a spoon. "Mr. Blackwood?" Dr. Chen approached him with the careful gentleness of someone about to deliver devastating news. "Grace's condition has deteriorated significantly. Her heart is failing, and we need to discuss immediate intervention options." Victoria stepped forward from where she'd been hovering near the entrance, still dripping rainwater onto the hospital's polished floor. "What does she need, doctor?" Chen glanced between them, clearly confused by the presence of this wealthy stranger. "Are you family?" "I'm—" Victoria hesitated, then looked at Ethan's exhausted face and made a decision that would change everything. "I'm someone who cares. What does Grace need to live?" "Experimental cardiac surgery using a new procedure developed by Montgomery Pharmaceuticals," Dr. Chen explained, her voice heavy with the weight of impossible circumstances. "The medication alone costs $500,000, not including surgical fees. Insurance won't cover it because it's still in trials." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, her father's company, the same company that had been testing heart medications on children exactly like Grace, children whose families couldn't afford the very treatments that might save their lives. The irony was so cruel it felt like destiny's twisted sense of humor. "I'll pay for it," Victoria said without hesitation. Ethan's head snapped up. "I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I'm choosing to do this. There's a difference." Dr. Chen looked between them with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd seen too many promises broken by harsh financial reality. "Miss, with all due respect, the cost—" "Victoria Montgomery," Victoria said quietly, watching recognition bloom in the doctor's eyes. And cost is not an object when it comes to saving this child's life. The next few hours blurred together like watercolors in rain. Grace was prepped for surgery while Victoria made phone calls that moved mountains of bureaucratic red tape. Ethan sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands, trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken. 6 hours ago, he'd been carrying his dying daughter through a storm. Now, a woman he'd saved from suicide was paying for experimental surgery with the casual ease of someone buying coffee. Eleanor Walsh arrived just as Grace was being wheeled into surgery, her weathered face creased with worry, and her gray hair escaping from a hastily tied headscarf. She took one look at Ethan's shell-shocked expression and wrapped him in the kind of hug that only grandmothers can give, fierce, protective, and unconditionally loving. "Who is she?" Eleanor whispered, nodding toward Victoria, who was speaking quietly with the surgical team. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, watching Victoria gesture emphatically at something on the doctor's clipboard. "She was going to jump from the bridge. I stopped her, and now she's this." Eleanor studied Victoria with the sharp eyes of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of human nature in all its complexity. "Child's running from something," she observed. "Question is, what's she running toward now?" Victoria returned to them, her expensive heels clicking against the hospital floor with a sound like small gunshots. She'd somehow found time to dry her hair and change into scrubs that a nurse had provided, but her eyes still held the hollow quality of someone who'd been staring into an abyss. "The surgery will take 4 to 6 hours, she reported, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Ethan. "Dr. Chen is confident about the procedure, but Grace's condition makes everything more complicated." "Why are you doing this?" Ethan asked, his voice raw with exhaustion and bewilderment. "You don't know us. You were ready to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Victoria was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When I was standing on that bridge tonight, I felt like I was invisible. Like my whole life was just empty space that wouldn't be missed if it disappeared. Then you appeared in the storm, carrying Grace. And you saw me. Really saw me. Not my name or my money or my father's expectations. Just me, a person worth saving." She turned to look at him, and Ethan saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You gave me a reason to live tonight, even if you didn't know it. Now, I want to give you a reason to keep fighting." Eleanor reached over and took Victoria's hand in her own, her touch gentle, despite the arthritis that gnarled her fingers. "Honey, what's your real story? And don't give me some sanitized version. I've been around too long for fairy tales." Victoria looked at this elderly woman who radiated the kind of wisdom that came from surviving life's hardest lessons. Something in Eleanor's expression, patient, non-judgmental, infinitely kind, broke down the walls Victoria had spent years building around her heart. "My father is Charles Montgomery," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was confessing. "The same company that makes the medication Grace needs, they've been testing it on children like her, poor children whose families can't fight back when things go wrong. I've been trying to gather evidence to expose him, but tonight I couldn't carry the weight of all that guilt anymore." Ethan stared at her, the implications hitting him like physical blows. "Your father's company is experimenting on kids?" "Dying kids," Victoria corrected, her voice hollow. "Kids whose parents are desperate enough to sign consent forms they don't fully understand. The survival rate is 60%, which sounds good until you realize that means 4 out of 10 children die so that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals can perfect a treatment they'll price out of reach for the families who need it most." The waiting room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the hospital, Machines beeping, conversations echoing down hallways, the eternal rhythm of people fighting to stay alive. Eleanor squeezed Victoria's hand tighter, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or even attraction. This broken, beautiful woman hadn't just saved Grace's life tonight. She'd chosen to trust them with the truth that could destroy her entire world. The surgery lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of pacing waiting room floors, drinking coffee that tasted like liquid despair, and watching the sun rise over Seattle through rain-streaked windows. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from the operating room, still wearing scrubs spotted with the evidence of Grace's fight for life, her tired smile was the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever seen. "She's stable," Dr. Chen announced, and Ethan's knees nearly buckled with relief. "The procedure was successful. Grace's heart is responding well to the medication, and her vital signs are stronger than we've seen in months." Victoria pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For the first time since her mother's death, she had been part of saving a life instead of watching one slip away. Eleanor wrapped her in a fierce hug, and for a moment the waiting room felt less like a place of sorrow and more like a sanctuary of hope. Over the following weeks, as Grace recovered in the pediatric cardiac unit, an unlikely family began to form. Victoria visited every day, bringing books and art supplies, teaching Grace to paint watercolor butterflies that covered the hospital room walls like a paper garden. She had taken indefinite leave from Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, telling her father she needed time to process her breakdown on the bridge. Ethan found himself looking forward to Victoria's visits with an intensity that both surprised and worried him. She would arrive each morning with coffee for the nurses, flowers for Grace's room, and a smile that seemed to grow more genuine each day. They talked for hours while Grace napped, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. "I never had a real family," Victoria confessed one afternoon, watching Grace color a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "My mother died when I was 16, and after that it was just me and Charles in that big empty house. He hired people to take care of me, tutors, nannies, drivers, but no one who actually cared about who I was becoming." Ethan looked up from the Get Well cards he was organizing, dozens of them from Grace's preschool classmates and neighbors. "What was your mom like?" Victoria's face softened with memory. "She was everything Charles isn't. Warm, funny, completely unimpressed by money or status. She grew up poor in rural Montana, won a scholarship to study at University of Washington, and met my father when he was still pretending to have a conscience." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of Grace's blanket. She would have loved Grace. Would have spent hours reading to her and teaching her to bake cookies that were always slightly burned around the edges. "She sounds wonderful," Ethan said softly. And she would have been horrified by what Montgomery Pharmaceuticals has become under Charles's leadership. Victoria's voice hardened with resolve. "Which is why I'm going to expose him." Eleanor, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, looked up sharply. "Child, that's dangerous talk. Men like your father don't just let people walk away with their secrets." "I know," Victoria replied, her jaw set with determination. "But I can't keep living with the blood on my hands. Every day I don't act, more children like Grace suffer. More families get crushed under medical bills they can never pay." Ethan studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the silk for the first time. "What exactly are you planning?" Victoria pulled out her laptop and opened a series of encrypted files. The screen filled with documents, photographs, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of systematic corporate evil. Test results showing dangerous side effects that had been buried. Financial records proving price manipulation. Audio recordings of Charles laughing about bleeding the desperate dry. I've been gathering evidence for months, she explained. Every board meeting I attended, every conversation I overheard, every document I could safely photograph. I have enough evidence to bring down Montgomery Pharmaceuticals and send Charles to prison for the rest of his life. Eleanor set down her knitting with a heavy sigh. And what happens to you when this comes out? You think your daddy's going to just pat you on the head and wish you luck? I'll be disowned, disinherited, probably threatened, Victoria acknowledged. But I'll be free. And more importantly, companies like Montgomery won't be able to prey on families like yours anymore. The weight of her sacrifice hung in the air like smoke. Victoria was preparing to give up billions of dollars, a life of luxury, and the only family she had left, all to protect people she'd never met from suffering she didn't have to witness. There's something else, Victoria said quietly, her cheeks flushing pink. Something I need to tell you both before I go down this path. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. Over the past 3 weeks, their friendship had deepened into something more complicated, something that made his chest tight with possibilities he was afraid to name. I'm falling in love with you, Victoria said simply, looking directly at Ethan. With both of you, really. Grace feels like the daughter I never thought I'd have, and you... She paused, searching for words. You make me want to be brave enough to deserve the life you've shown me. Grace, who had been pretending to sleep, opened her eyes and grinned at them both. Does this mean Vicky can be my new mommy? The question hung in the room like a prayer. Ethan looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and saw past the designer clothes and pharmaceutical fortune to the woman who had chosen to save his daughter's life, who visited every day with homemade soup and terrible knock-knock jokes, who had painted Grace's fingernails rainbow colors because it made her giggle. I love you too, he said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. But Victoria, if you go through with this, exposing your father, there's no going back. You'll lose everything. No, Victoria said firmly, reaching out to take his hand while Grace snuggled between them. I'll finally have everything that matters. But their moment of happiness was shattered by the sound of expensive shoes clicking down the hospital corridor. Charles Montgomery appeared in the doorway like a storm cloud in a $1,000 suit, his face carved from granite and his eyes burning with barely controlled fury. Victoria. His voice was silk wrapped around a blade. We need to talk. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Eleanor instinctively moved closer to Grace's bed, her grandmother's instincts sensing predator in the presence of prey. Ethan stood slowly, placing himself between Charles and his daughter. Hello, Father, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled. I was wondering when you'd track me down. Charles stepped into the room with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to owning every space he entered. His gaze swept over Ethan dismissively before settling on Grace with cold calculation. So this is the child, he observed, his tone suggesting Grace was an interesting specimen rather than a human being. The one requiring our experimental cardiac medication. Her name is Grace, Victoria said sharply. Yes, I'm sure she has a name. They all do. Charles pulled out his phone and scrolled through something that made his mouth curve in a smile that had nothing to do with humor. Grace Blackwood, age 4, daughter of Ethan Blackwood, former Seattle Fire Department captain, fired for refusing to falsify safety inspection reports for Montgomery Chemical Plant No. 7. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The plant. The explosion that had killed Sarah. Charles continued his recitation like he was reading a grocery list. Sarah Blackwood, deceased, formerly employed as safety inspector for the Washington State Department of Labor. Cause of death, industrial accident resulting from equipment failure at Montgomery Chemical Plant No. 7. You son of a bitch, Ethan breathed, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. Language, Mr. Blackwood. There are children present. Charles's smile widened. Though I suppose accuracy is important. Sarah Blackwood died because she was planning to file a report that would have cost Montgomery Industries approximately $50 million in safety upgrades and regulatory fines. Her accident was convenient timing. Victoria's face had gone white as hospital sheets. Father, what are you saying? I'm saying that your new boyfriend's wife died because she couldn't leave well enough alone. Just like you, Victoria. Just like this touching little family you've decided to play house with. Charles stepped closer to Grace's bed, and Eleanor moved to block his path like a lioness protecting her cub. The beautiful thing about children, Charles continued conversationally, is how fragile they are. Take little Grace here. One medication adjustment, one small change in dosage, and her heart could stop again. This time, perhaps permanently. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria shot to her feet, fury radiating from her like heat. You're threatening to murder a 4-year-old child. I'm explaining consequences, Charles corrected smoothly. You want to play whistleblower? Fine. But understand that actions have reactions. Walk away from this crusade of yours, marry Jonathan Whitmore as planned, and Grace continues to receive the medication that's keeping her alive. Continue down this path of rebellion, and let's see how long her little heart keeps beating without pharmaceutical support. Eleanor spoke up from beside Grace's bed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 8 decades of bullies and monsters. You listen to me, you piece of garbage in an expensive suit. I've seen men like you before, cowards who threaten children because they can't face real consequences. But you made one mistake. Charles raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that? Eleanor smiled, and it was sharp as broken glass. You assumed we'd be fighting you alone. As if summoned by her words, Detective Mike Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights and a recording device visible in his shirt pocket. Charles Montgomery, Rodriguez said with satisfaction, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and threatening a minor, and thanks to your daughter's evidence and your own confession just now, we've got you dead to rights. The look of shock on Charles's face was worth every terrifying moment that had led to this instant. Victoria had been recording their conversation on her phone, and Rodriguez had been listening from the hallway, gathering evidence for a case that had been building for months. As Charles was led away in handcuffs, his final words to Victoria were a promise wrapped in a curse. You'll regret this for the rest of your life. Victoria watched her father disappear down the hospital corridor, then turned to Ethan and Grace with tears streaming down her face. It's over, she whispered. It's finally over. But even as they held each other in relief, none of them could shake the feeling that Charles Montgomery's arrest was just the beginning of their real fight for survival. The media storm hit like a Category 5 hurricane. Within hours of Charles Montgomery's arrest, news vans lined the street outside Seattle Children's Hospital like mechanical vultures waiting to feast on tragedy. Reporters with perfect hair and predatory smiles thrust microphones at anyone wearing scrubs, desperate for quotes about the pharmaceutical scandal that was already being called Heartgate on social media. Grace pressed her small face against the hospital window, watching the chaos below with the wide-eyed fascination that only children possess. Why are all those people here, Daddy? Ethan pulled the blinds closed, his jaw tight with protective fury. Because sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, and other grown-ups want to tell everyone about it. Victoria sat in the corner chair, her laptop open to a cascade of news articles that painted her as everything from a heroic whistleblower to a spoiled heiress seeking attention. The comments sections were particularly brutal, filled with speculation about her motives, her sanity, and her relationship with Ethan. Someone had already leaked hospital security footage of them holding hands beside Grace's bed. "Listen to this," Victoria said, her voice hollow as she read from her screen. "Victoria Montgomery's sudden conscience seems conveniently timed with her new romance with a working-class firefighter. Is this genuine remorse or calculated image rehabilitation?" Eleanor looked up from her knitting, steel in her weathered eyes. "Child, you can't read that poison. Let the vultures circle. We know the truth." But the truth felt fragile in the face of such overwhelming scrutiny. Dr. Chen knocked softly before entering, her usually calm demeanor shadowed with concern. "I need to discuss Grace's treatment plan," she said quietly. "With Charles Montgomery's arrest, there are complications." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What kind of complications?" "The medication Grace has been receiving is still in experimental trials. With Montgomery Pharmaceuticals under federal investigation, all their research programs have been suspended indefinitely. We have enough of Grace's medication to last maybe 2 weeks before—" She didn't need to finish. Before Grace's heart started failing again. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. There has to be another option. Other companies working on similar treatments. Other trials she can enter. Dr. Chen shook her head sadly. Montgomery held the patents on the specific compound combination that's been working for Grace. Other treatments exist, but they're not as effective. And the waiting lists are months long. Grace's condition is too advanced to wait. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Grace's heart monitor, a sound that had become as essential as breathing but now felt as fragile as a soap bubble. Grace looked up from her coloring book, somehow sensing the adult tension even if she couldn't understand it. "Is something wrong with my medicine?" "No, sweetheart," Ethan said quickly, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "The grown-ups are just figuring some things out." But Grace had inherited her mother's intuition along with her blue eyes. She set down her crayons and crawled onto Victoria's lap with the matter-of-fact trust that only children possess. "Are you sad because of your daddy?" she asked Victoria directly. Victoria's breath caught, out of the mouths of babes. "A little bit, yes." "My first mommy went to heaven," Grace said seriously, patting Victoria's cheek with a small hand that smelled like hospital soap and crayon wax. "But she told me in a dream that it's okay to love new people. Love doesn't run out like medicine does." The simplicity of her wisdom broke something inside Victoria's chest. She buried her face in Grace's soft hair and cried, for her mother, for her father, for all the children who had suffered while she lived in willful ignorance. Over the following days, their situation grew increasingly desperate. The media attention brought both support and scrutiny. A GoFundMe page started by complete strangers raised over $200,000 for Grace's treatment, but money couldn't buy medication that didn't exist. Protesters gathered outside Montgomery Pharmaceuticals headquarters, demanding the immediate release of all experimental treatments to the patients who needed them. Ethan returned to his construction job, partly for the normalcy, and partly because their savings were evaporating under the pressure of daily hospital expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. Victoria had been cut off from the Montgomery fortune the moment her father was arrested, her credit cards canceled, and her bank accounts frozen pending investigation. "I should have seen this coming," she said one evening as they shared takeout Chinese food in Grace's hospital room. "Charles never leaves anything to chance. He probably had contingency plans for this exact scenario." Eleanor looked up from helping Grace eat her fortune cookie. "What's your fortune say, honey?" Grace squinted at the tiny paper strip. "Your greatest treasure is hidden in plain sight." "Smart cookie," Eleanor observed, literally and figuratively. But their moment of levity was shattered by urgent footsteps in the hallway. Dr. Chen burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "I may have found something," she announced breathlessly. "There's a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland that's been developing a similar cardiac medication. They're willing to provide emergency compassionate use for Grace, but—" "But what?" Ethan demanded. "She'd have to be transported there for treatment." "The medication can't be shipped. It's too unstable. And the cost—" Dr. Chen hesitated. "We're talking about potentially months of treatment in a Swiss cardiac facility. The expense would be astronomical." Victoria's mind raced through the implications. Switzerland. Months of treatment. Costs that would bankrupt them even with the GoFundMe money. "How much are we talking about?" she asked. "Conservative estimate, $2 million, possibly more if complications arise." The number hit the room like a physical blow. $2 million might as well have been $2 billion for a family already drowning in medical debt. Grace looked around at the three adults, reading their expressions with the uncanny accuracy that seriously ill children develop. "Is it because we don't have enough money?" "Money isn't everything, sweetheart," Ethan said softly, but his voice carried the weight of a man who knew that sometimes money was the difference between life and death. That night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Victoria sat alone in the hospital corridor staring at her phone. She had one contact she hadn't blocked: Jonathan Whitmore, the oil executive's son she was supposed to marry. He had called 17 times since the scandal broke, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. With shaking fingers, she dialed his number. "Victoria?" Jonathan's voice was sharp with relief. "Thank God you finally called. We need to talk." "I know what you want to talk about," Victoria said quietly. "This whole situation, it's salvageable. My father's lawyers think we can spin this as a breakdown. Temporary insanity brought on by your father's pressure. You check into a private facility for a few months. We have a quiet wedding when you get out, and everyone moves on." Victoria closed her eyes, picturing Grace's face as she'd asked about money. "And in return, your father's legal troubles disappear. The charges get reduced to corporate negligence instead of murder. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals gets restructured under new management, namely mine, and everyone wins. Everyone except the children who died in those trials." Jonathan's voice hardened. "Victoria, be realistic. Those kids were going to die anyway. At least this way, their deaths contributed to medical advancement, and more importantly, you get your life back. Your real life." "This is my real life," Victoria said firmly. "Grace and Ethan and Eleanor. This is the most real my life has ever been." "A construction worker and his sick kid? Victoria, you can't be serious. You're worth billions. You could help thousands of children with that kind of money, not just one." The argument was seductive in its logic, and Victoria felt herself wavering. Save Grace by condemning her father to a lighter sentence and accepting a loveless marriage, or watch the little girl who had become her daughter die for the sake of principle. "I need time to think," she whispered. "You have 24 hours, Jonathan replied coldly. "After that, the offer expires, and your father spends the rest of his life in prison while the kid dies anyway." Victoria ended the call and sat in the fluorescent-lit corridor, feeling like she was back on the bridge again, balanced between two impossible choices. This time, though, it wasn't just her own life hanging in the balance. Inside the hospital room, Ethan lay on the narrow cot beside Grace's bed, listening to his daughter's steady breathing and praying to a God he wasn't sure cared about the problems of working-class families caught between corporate giants. Eleanor sat in her chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a baby blanket for no one in particular, a habit she'd developed after losing her own child decades ago. She watched Victoria through the glass door, recognizing the posture of someone about to make a terrible sacrifice. "Lord," Eleanor whispered into the quiet room. Sometimes your tests are harder than human hearts were meant to bear. But if you're listening, we could sure use a miracle about now. Outside, Seattle slept on, unaware that in one hospital room, a small family was about to be torn apart by forces beyond their control. Grace stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching instinctively for Victoria's empty chair. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, marking time like a countdown clock to an impossible decision. Victoria made her choice at 3:47 a.m., staring at Grace's sleeping face in the dim glow of medical monitors. She kissed the little girl's forehead with the reverence of a prayer, whispered, "I love you," to Ethan's sleeping form, and slipped out of the hospital room like a ghost abandoning paradise. By dawn, she was sitting across from Jonathan Whitmore in his father's downtown law office, signing papers that felt like her own death warrant. The prenuptial agreement was 23 pages of legal language that essentially made her a well-dressed prisoner, but the medical authorization forms that would restart Grace's treatment were worth every signature. "Smart choice," Jonathan said, his smile as cold as January rain. "The wedding will be small, private. We'll say you needed time to recover from your father's difficulties." Victoria didn't trust herself to speak. Instead, she focused on the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering if this was how her mother had felt when she'd married Charles. Trapped between love and survival, choosing the lesser evil in a world designed to crush the vulnerable. The plan moved with corporate efficiency that would have impressed her father. Charles Montgomery's charges were quietly reduced through political machinations Victoria didn't want to understand. Grace's medication was mysteriously discovered in a warehouse that had supposedly been overlooked during the investigation freeze. The Swiss treatment facility suddenly had an opening that perfectly matched Grace's needs. Ethan learned about Victoria's engagement on the morning news, watching in horror as footage showed her walking into a courthouse hand in hand with a man whose smile never reached his eyes. The reporter's voice was clinically cheerful as she explained how the pharmaceutical heiress had found love during her time of crisis and would be married in a private ceremony the following month. Grace was eating breakfast when the news played, her small fingers wrapped around a spoon loaded with oatmeal that suddenly seemed too heavy to lift. "Why is Angel Lady holding hands with that man?" she asked, her voice small and confused. Ethan couldn't find words that would make sense to a 4-year-old. How do you explain betrayal to someone who still believes in fairy tales? How do you tell a child that sometimes the people who save you are the ones who destroy you? "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand," Eleanor said gently, moving to sit beside Grace's hospital bed. Her weathered hands shook slightly as she smoothed the little girl's hair. "But that doesn't mean they stop loving you." Grace stared at the television screen where Victoria was now stepping into a limousine that probably cost more than Ethan's annual salary. But she promised she wouldn't leave. The accusation hit Ethan like a physical blow because it was true. Victoria had promised in 100 small ways that she would stay. She had painted Grace's nails and read bedtime stories and talked about teaching her to ride a bike when she got stronger. She had looked at Ethan with eyes full of forever and whispered plans for a future that apparently meant nothing when measured against pharmaceutical billions. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway with news that should have been cause for celebration. "Grace's medication has been approved for continuation. The treatment facility in Switzerland is preparing for her arrival next week." "Because of her?" Ethan nodded toward the television where Victoria was now being interviewed about her whirlwind romance. Dr. Chen's expression was carefully neutral. "The funding came through proper channels. That's all I can tell you." But Ethan understood the subtext. Victoria had bought Grace's life with her own freedom, trading her happiness for his daughter's heartbeat. The knowledge was both devastating and humbling. She had sacrificed everything for them, and he had no way to stop it. Over the next week, as Grace grew stronger on her resumed medication, the distance between their old life and their new reality became increasingly apparent. The media attention that had once focused on their love story now painted Ethan as the construction worker who had been dumped for a billionaire oil heir. Social media was brutal in its assessment of his worth compared to Jonathan Whitmore's fortune. Grace stopped asking about Victoria after the third day, but Ethan caught her staring out the window sometimes with an expression too old for her young face. She had learned at 4 years old that love didn't always conquer all. Sometimes it just made the losses hurt more. Eleanor tried to maintain normalcy, bringing puzzle books and teaching Grace to knit with tiny needles, but even her optimistic spirit was dimmed by the weight of their collective heartbreak. She had lived through enough tragedy to recognize the signs of a family fracturing under pressure it was never meant to bear. The breaking point came when Grace's treatment was scheduled to begin in Switzerland. Dr. Chen explained that Ethan would need to take extended leave from work to accompany Grace for what could be months of treatment. The financial implications were staggering. Not just the cost of living in Europe, but the loss of his construction job and the complete disruption of their carefully balanced survival. "I can't do it," Ethan confessed to Eleanor one night after Grace had fallen asleep. "I can't take her charity money and pretend it doesn't come with Victoria's blood on it." "Pride's a luxury you can't afford," Eleanor replied sharply, her knitting needles clicking with unusual force. "That little girl needs this treatment, and she needs her daddy to swallow his hurt feelings and do what's necessary." "It's not about pride," Ethan protested. It's about you being angry at the wrong person," Eleanor interrupted. "Victoria didn't choose money over you. She chose Grace's life over her own happiness." "There's a difference, and if you can't see it, then you're a bigger fool than I thought." The truth of her words hit Ethan like cold water, forcing him to confront the reality he'd been avoiding. Victoria hadn't betrayed them. She had saved them in the only way the system allowed. Her engagement to Jonathan Whitmore wasn't about love or greed. It was about a young woman sacrificing herself on the altar of corporate power to keep a little girl's heart beating. As Grace slept peacefully in her hospital bed, her breathing steady and strong thanks to Victoria's sacrifice, Ethan realized that sometimes the greatest acts of love looked exactly like abandonment from the outside. Victoria had walked away not because she stopped caring, but because she cared too much to watch Grace die when she had the power to prevent it. The wedding was scheduled for the following Friday. Grace's departure for Switzerland was planned for Saturday. Somewhere across the city, Victoria was preparing to marry a man she despised to save a family that now hated her for it. The phone call came at midnight, 3 days before Victoria's wedding. Detective Rodriguez's voice was tight with exhaustion and something that sounded like fear. "Ethan, I need you to get to the hospital immediately. Bring Eleanor if she's willing to come. Don't tell anyone where you're going." "What's wrong? Is it Grace?" Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he shook Eleanor awake on the couch where she'd been dozing. "Grace is fine, but we've uncovered something about Victoria's situation, something that changes everything." Rodriguez paused, and Ethan could hear papers rustling in the background. Charles Montgomery didn't just threaten Grace that day in the hospital. He meant it. Eleanor was already reaching for her coat, her grandmother's instincts sharp despite being pulled from sleep. "What's happening?" "I'll explain when you get here," Rodriguez said. "Use the emergency entrance. Don't go through the main lobby." The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Seattle's empty streets stretching before them like a fever dream. Eleanor clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "That girl's in trouble," she murmured, staring out at the city lights. "I can feel it in my bones. Men like Charles Montgomery don't just quietly accept defeat." They found Rodriguez waiting in a conference room adjacent to Grace's ward, his face grim in the fluorescent lighting. Spread across the table were photographs, documents, and what looked like medical charts that made Ethan's stomach clench with dread. "Sit down," Rodriguez said quietly. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear." Ethan remained standing, his arms crossed defensively. "Just tell me what's going on." "Victoria didn't choose to marry Jonathan Whitmore," Rodriguez began. "She was forced into it by a threat that goes deeper than we initially understood. Charles Montgomery may be in jail, but his reach extends far beyond those walls." He picked up a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed Grace's IV line, magnified to show details that made Eleanor gasp in recognition. "This is Grace's current medication setup. Look at this modification. See this additional port that wasn't part of her original treatment protocol?" Ethan studied the image, his construction worker's eye for detail catching the subtle difference. "What is it?" "It's a remote injection site," Rodriguez explained grimly. "Someone has modified Grace's IV system so that additional substances can be introduced without detection by the nursing staff. The modification was done professionally, probably by someone with access to her medical care." Eleanor's face went pale as ash. "You're saying someone could poison her through her IV? Or withdraw her life-saving medication remotely?" Charles Montgomery arranged for this modification through contacts in the medical equipment industry. It's essentially a kill switch that can be activated from anywhere in the world. The room spun around Ethan as the implications hit him like a physical blow. "They're holding Grace hostage." "More than that," Rodriguez continued, pulling out another document. "This is a recorded conversation between Charles and Jonathan Whitmore, obtained through a federal wiretap. Listen." He pressed play on a small recording device. Charles's voice filled the room, cold and calculating even through the phone line distortion. "The child remains healthy as long as Victoria behaves. One word of rebellion, one attempt to back out of this marriage, and little Grace Blackwood suffers a tragic relapse. These things happen with experimental medications. Sometimes the heart just stops responding to treatment." Jonathan's voice responded with casual cruelty that made Eleanor's hands shake. "And if the construction worker becomes a problem?" "Industrial accidents are surprisingly common in Seattle. Crane failures, scaffolding collapses, occupational hazards of manual labor. The beauty is that grief makes people compliant. A widowed Victoria will be much easier to manage." The recording ended, leaving silence that felt like a scream. Ethan sank into a chair, the weight of understanding crushing his chest. Victoria hadn't abandoned them. She was being held prisoner by threats against their lives. "How long have you known about this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We intercepted the conversation 2 days ago. We've been working around the clock to confirm the medical modification and gather enough evidence to act." Rodriguez gathered the photographs into a neat pile. "Victoria doesn't know we're on to them. As far as she's aware, marrying Jonathan Whitmore is the only way to keep you and Grace alive." Eleanor spoke up from her corner chair, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That brave girl is sacrificing herself to protect us, and we're sitting here letting her do it." "Not anymore," Rodriguez said firmly. "We have enough evidence now to arrest Jonathan Whitmore and add additional charges against Charles. But we need your help to make this work." "Anything," Ethan said immediately. "The wedding is in 3 days. We need Victoria to go through with the ceremony as planned, but we'll be ready to move the moment she says, 'I do.' Our medical team will simultaneously remove the IV modification and place Grace under protective custody. Charles's people won't have time to react." "What about Victoria?" Eleanor demanded. "What happens to her when these monsters realize they've been caught?" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "That's the risky part. Jonathan Whitmore is unstable, possibly dangerous. When he realizes the marriage is a trap, Victoria will be in immediate physical danger. We'll have agents at the wedding, but weddings are chaotic and things can go wrong. Ethan finished, his mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. There's something else, Rodriguez added reluctantly. Charles Montgomery has been moved to a minimum security federal facility pending his sentencing. His lawyers argued successfully that he's not a flight risk due to his age and health conditions. Eleanor snorted derisively. Health conditions meaning he bought himself a comfortable prison stay. The point is, he has access to phones, computers, and visitors. He's still actively coordinating this operation from behind bars. Taking down Jonathan won't necessarily stop the threat to Grace. Ethan looked through the conference room window toward Grace's room, where his daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her IV line had been turned into a weapon aimed at her heart. The monitors showed her vital signs strong and steady for now. "I want to see her," Ethan said suddenly. "See who?" Rodriguez asked. "Victoria. I want to talk to her before the wedding." Rodriguez shook his head. "Too dangerous. If Jonathan or Charles's people suspect we're on to them, they could accelerate their timeline. Grace could be in immediate danger. Then what are we supposed to do? Just sit here and wait while she walks into a trap?" Eleanor stood slowly, her arthritis making the movement painful, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived 8 decades of human cruelty and kindness in equal measure. "We do what families do," she said simply. "We trust each other, and we fight for each other. Victoria is fighting for Grace in the only way she knows how. Now we fight for her the same way." Over the next 2 days, their hospital room became the center of a covert operation that felt like something from a spy movie. Federal agents disguised as hospital staff moved in and out, installing surveillance equipment and security measures. Grace's IV modification was carefully documented but left in place to avoid alerting Charles's people. Dr. Chen was briefed on the situation and became part of the conspiracy to protect her patient. She increased Grace's security monitoring and arranged for backup medical staff to be on standby during the wedding ceremony. Ethan couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely focus on Grace's daily care routines. The knowledge that Victoria was preparing to sacrifice herself while believing she was protecting them was a constant weight on his chest. Every news report about the upcoming fairy tale wedding felt like watching someone prepare for their own execution. Eleanor maintained her vigil by Grace's bedside, knitting baby blankets with fierce concentration while keeping watch over the little girl who had become the center of everyone's world. She occasionally hummed old hymns under her breath, songs about valleys of shadows and walking through darkness. "Daddy, why are you so sad?" Grace asked on the morning of the wedding, her small hand touching Ethan's face with concern that broke his heart. "Sometimes grown-ups worry about people they love," he said, trying to smile for her benefit. "Are you worried about Angel Lady?" The question pierced him like a blade. Grace somehow understood, with the intuition that seriously ill children develop, that Victoria was in danger even though no adult had explained the situation to her. "Yes, sweetheart." "I'm worried about Victoria." Grace nodded solemnly, then reached under her pillow and pulled out a drawing she'd been working on in secret. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow with the words "Family Forever" written in crayon across the top. "Will you give this to her, so she knows we still love her even when she's far away?" Ethan took the drawing with hands that trembled, understanding that his 4-year-old daughter had just given him the key to saving the woman they all loved. It was time to crash a wedding. The wedding took place in the Fairmont Olympic Hotel's Georgian Room, a space designed for fairy tale endings that felt more like a gilded cage. Victoria stood before an ornate mirror in the bridal suite, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary, her reflection showing a woman preparing for her own funeral rather than her wedding day. Her hands shook as she applied lipstick the color of dried blood, a shade Jonathan had personally selected because it complemented her complexion. Everything about this day had been chosen for her. The flowers, the music, the guest list filled with oil executives and pharmaceutical board members who viewed her marriage as a business merger rather than a union of hearts. "You look beautiful," said Rebecca Whitmore, Jonathan's mother, adjusting Victoria's veil with the clinical efficiency of someone arranging a display. "Jonathan is so fortunate to have found you during such a difficult time." Victoria nodded numbly, unable to trust her voice. Through the suite's windows she could see Seattle's skyline, and somewhere in that maze of buildings was a hospital room where Grace was probably asking Eleanor why her angel lady wasn't visiting anymore. The ceremony began at 4 p.m. sharp. Victoria walked down the aisle on the arm of her court-appointed guardian, since Charles was indisposed in federal custody. The Georgian room was filled with 200 guests, who applauded politely as she approached the altar where Jonathan waited with a smile that never reached his eyes. Detective Rodriguez sat in the back row, disguised in a rented tuxedo, his hand resting casually near the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Federal agents were positioned throughout the room as waiters, photographers, and wedding coordinators, all waiting for his signal to move. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, his voice echoing through the ornate room, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jonathan William Whitmore and Victoria Margaret Montgomery in holy matrimony." Victoria's eyes found the stained glass window above the altar, its colored light casting rainbow patterns that reminded her of Grace's drawings. She thought about the little girl's question. Why grown-ups sometimes had to make choices that seemed wrong but were really about protecting the people they loved. "Marriage is not a decision to be taken lightly," the officiant continued, seemingly oblivious to the irony of his words. "It requires commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to put another's needs before your own." At Seattle Children's Hospital, Ethan sat beside Grace's bed, holding his daughter's small hand while watching the wedding coverage on the room's television. Grace had insisted on seeing Angel Lady's princess dress, not understanding why the adults around her looked like they were attending an execution rather than a celebration. Eleanor paced by the window, her weathered hands clutching Grace's crayon drawing like a talisman. "This is wrong," she muttered. "That girl shouldn't have to sacrifice herself for our peace of mind." "The medical team is in position," Dr. Chen whispered to Ethan, checking her watch. "The moment Detective Rodriguez gives the signal, we'll remove the IV modification and place Grace under protective custody." On the television screen, the officiant was asking about objections. "If anyone here present knows of any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The silence in the Georgian room was deafening. Victoria closed her eyes, thinking of Grace's laugh, of Ethan's gentle hands, of Eleanor's wisdom and warmth. She thought of the family she'd found and was about to lose forever. "I object." The voice came from the back of the room, clear and strong despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. Every head turned as Ethan Blackwood walked down the aisle, still wearing his hospital visitor's badge, Grace's drawing clutched in his hand like a battle flag. "Sir, this is a private ceremony," Jonathan sputtered, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Private?" Ethan's voice carried across the room with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Then why are there federal agents positioned around the room, and why is the bride being married under threat of murdering a 4-year-old child?" Gasps rippled through the assembled guests as Rodriguez and his team simultaneously revealed their weapons and badges. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" Chaos erupted in the Georgian room as wedding guests dove for cover and agents swarmed toward the altar. Jonathan grabbed Victoria's arm with bruising force, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into rage. "You set me up," he snarled, pulling a small device from his jacket pocket. "One press of this button and the little girl's heart stops forever." "Actually," Rodriguez said calmly, approaching with his weapon drawn, "that won't work anymore. We removed your remote access to Grace's IV system about an hour ago. Charles Montgomery is also being transferred to maximum security as we speak." Victoria stared at Ethan, hardly daring to believe he was real, that he had somehow found a way to save her just as she had once saved him on the bridge. "How did you know?" "A very smart 4-year-old drew me a picture," Ethan said, holding up Grace's crayon masterpiece. "She told me to give this to you so you'd know we still love you even when you're far away. Except you don't have to be far away anymore." Jonathan's grip tightened on Victoria's arm as he realized his leverage was gone. "You think this changes anything? My family has connections you can't imagine. We'll destroy all of you." "Your family's about to have bigger problems," Rodriguez informed him as additional agents moved in for the arrest. "We've been monitoring your offshore accounts, your pharmaceutical investments, and your interesting business relationships with Charles Montgomery. You're looking at conspiracy charges, racketeering, and accessory to murder." As Jonathan was led away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and promises of legal retaliation, Victoria finally allowed herself to collapse. The weight of months of fear and sacrifice crashed over her like a tsunami, leaving her sobbing in her wedding dress on the Georgian room's marble floor. Ethan knelt beside her, careful not to wrinkle the expensive silk as he gathered her into his arms. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "You're safe now. Grace is safe. We're all safe." "I thought I'd lost you forever," Victoria cried, her carefully applied makeup streaming down her cheeks in colorful rivulets. "I thought you hated me for leaving." "I could never hate you," Ethan said firmly. "What you did, sacrificing yourself to protect Grace, that's the most loving thing anyone has ever done for our family." Eleanor appeared beside them, having somehow managed to get from the hospital to the hotel in record time despite her arthritis and advanced age. She wrapped both of them in a fierce hug that smelled like lavender and determination. "Come on, you two," she said briskly, helping them to their feet. "We have a little girl who's been asking for her angel lady all week, and I promised her we'd bring you home." The drive back to the hospital was surreal, Victoria still wearing her wedding dress while Ethan held her hand in the back seat of Eleanor's ancient Buick. The city lights blurred past the windows like falling stars, and for the first time in months, Victoria felt like she could breathe again. Grace was waiting in her hospital bed, propped up on pillows and wearing a tiara made from construction paper and glitter that Eleanor had helped her make. When Victoria appeared in the doorway, still in her wedding gown, Grace's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Angel lady! You came back!" Grace held out her arms for a hug that Victoria accepted with the reverence of someone receiving absolution. "I promised I would never leave you," Victoria whispered, tears falling onto Grace's soft hair. "And I'm done breaking promises." "Are you going to marry my daddy now instead?" Grace asked with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a 4-year-old. Victoria looked at Ethan over Grace's head, seeing her future reflected in his eyes. Not the cold perfection of pharmaceutical billions, but the warm chaos of a real family built on love instead of leverage. "If he'll have me," she said softly. "We'll have you," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for as long as you'll stay." Outside the hospital window, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, and somewhere across the city, Aurora Bridge stood silhouetted against the stars, no longer a place of desperation, but a symbol of the moment when 3 broken people found each other and chose to become whole. Grace fell asleep between them, her small hands holding on to both Victoria and Ethan as if to anchor them to this perfect moment when love finally conquered the forces that had tried to tear them apart. They were home. Dear friends, this story reminds us that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens, becoming more precious because we understand its true value. Like Eleanor, who at 78 became the grandmother Grace never had, we discover that our greatest contributions often come not from what we accumulate, but from what we give away. Victoria's sacrifice mirrors the choices many of us have made throughout our lives, putting family before fortune, choosing connection over convenience. Ethan's journey from despair to hope reflects our own resilience through life's storms. But perhaps most powerfully, this story shows us that it's never too late for second chances. Whether you're 55 or 85, whether you're raising grandchildren, caring for aging parents, or rediscovering love after loss, your story isn't over. Every day offers opportunities to be someone's bridge from despair to hope, to choose courage over comfort, to prove that the best chapters of our lives can be written at any age. The wisdom we've earned through decades of living, that's our superpower. Like Eleanor's steady presence that anchored this fractured family, your experience, your love, your unwavering faith in tomorrow can be the difference between someone's darkness and their dawn. What moment in your life taught you that love requires sacrifice? Have you ever been someone's Eleanor, the steady presence that helped a family through crisis? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.